Hello, welcome to day 4, the final day of EUNIC's Digital Experience Artificial Intelligence Week, co-presented with the Goethe Institute.
Just a word for anyone new to EUNIC. It stands for the European Union National Institutes for Culture and is a network of EU organizations, such as the Goethe Institute, engaging in cultural relations to strengthen dialogue, cultural cooperation, and diversity worldwide.
During this week's program, we've gone deep with discussions of accelerated digital transformation, an acceleration exemplified by the fact we're all here meeting on Zoom right now, and the implications of AI on cultural relations, creativity, and, as we'll discuss today, education.
Day 1 was all about adapting to a future that, due to COVID-19, arrived ahead of schedule. As we navigate a vastly increased dependence on network digital technologies, how are we to maintain community and dynamic relations? How do we ensure accessibility for all? How do institutions manage a magnitude of data, adapt to new challenges, and wisely leverage new opportunities while being mindful of the bias that is often inadvertently built into machine learning datasets? Anchoring Day 1 was a keynote from Sabine Verheyen, chair of the EU Parliament Committee on Culture and Education and as rapporteur on AI, synthesizing the challenges and opportunities of this digital transformation, and calling for preparedness and maintaining Europe's role in cultural relations in a broadly and rapidly changing world.
Day 2 began our journey into all things artificial intelligence. Although, as we learned, there are a few unique technologies, machine learning for one, that fall under the colloquial umbrella of AI. The technologies of AI are still developing, the implications still a space of speculation, but it is essential that ethics remain central to this process. What challenges and risks may arise, or have already arrived, in the geopolitical space were discussed in our second panel. Privacy, algorithmic influences and bias, and consideration of digital divides that are existing or may develop are all topics that must remain central to cultural relations in the future as we develop a European way of engaging with AI. And the Grid, EUNIC's pilot project in Silicon Valley, hosted an extensive session on developing new ways of partnerships between arts organizations, governmental institutions, and the private sector, ensuring that artists and European institutions have agency and influence within the R&D process of the technologies that inevitably will change the world.
Yesterday, Day 3, we dove into the more philosophical questions around AI. Speaking with artists and thinkers, we discovered the ways artists are collaborating with machine learning, what AI means for human creativity, and what AI can teach humanity about itself. I love the idea, for instance, that AI is not something that artists compete with, but rather it allows us to be more human. It opens up new realms of being human. We also that evening, yesterday evening, had a live performance and discussion with 2 artists working with machine learning, discussing alien forms of intelligence and pattern recognition in their work, where AI is used to develop new forms of language.
And language is where we have arrived today. We'll speak about AI in education broadly, but language learning is a particular field in which these new technologies offer new opportunities. Much of this week's program will be available on EUNIC's YouTube channel. So if there's anything you missed or want to revisit, it's there for you.
So we will now dig into the content of Day 4, Teaching with AI, the impact of AI on education and language learning, with a panel of experts working in the field of technology-enhanced learning. We'll hear from 2 entrepreneurs developing products that are already in use.
Linguist Michael Campbell, who is the founder and CEO of Glossika, an AI-powered language learning interface for users that continuously calibrates the lesson speed to your learning speed and needs as you progress. And Priya Lakhani, the founder and CEO of Century Tech, which offers an intelligent intervention tool for educators to better understand their students' individual needs and to tailor content more effectively, making sure no student gets lost in the stream. One can imagine this being particularly useful under COVID conditions, where classroom learning is often happening at a distance.
Also joining us for this panel is Riina Vuorikari, a high-level consultant in the area of technology-enhanced learning, or TEL, and e-learning for schools. Riina has worked with a large array of European educational entities, from European Schoolnet to the Flemish Ministry of Education to the CGIAR Foundation. And since 2016, she has been a research fellow at the European Commission's Science Service Joint Research Center in Sevilla, Spain.
We will first hear from Michael and Priya, and then we will ask Riina to share some of her recent research with us and perhaps reflect on the tools that Michael and Priya have developed.
So, Michael, if you'd like to start, the stage is now yours. Here's Michael Campbell, founder and CEO of Glossika, and also a linguist. And also, you're in Taipei, so it's already evening where you are. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Caroline and Julian, for inviting me for this talk and the EUNIC conference. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to everybody about machine learning. I don't normally tend to think of it as artificial intelligence, because I think that there's still a long ways to go until these things become intelligent. But we, between Priya and I, there's a couple different approaches that we take to education. We're more focused on the actual language data, but through that data and the analysis of that data, we can also find the positioning for our students. So for example, what we do is we analyze the semantic and syntactic structures of languages. And we have built a new platform called Glossika Viva, where we have, for example, we've posted basically 7,000 languages on that platform. And we invite collaborators, whether they're teachers, translators, they can come onto the platform, develop new content. And what our machine learning algorithms do is in the background, is they analyze these languages. They analyze the structures, the syntactic structures. We do tokenization, which means breaking languages down into individual words. One area where AI is still lacking quite a bit is in multi-word expressions. So for example, if you just use something very simple like fire department, a lot of times that could be misunderstood as two separate things. Whereas when we speak, this is more of a problem in English rather than in German, where all the words are stuck together as a single long word. But the multi-word expressions can also be very complex in German because your verbs get split up all over the sentence. You'll have a past participle that appears at the end of the sentence. You'll have a reciprocal element that appears quite near the beginning of the sentence. But all of these elements are related to each other in a German sentence. And so the word order of German wreaks havoc on being able to understand not just the syntax, but the semantics, the semantic meanings. So every language has its own particular areas that need attention. And one of those areas is MWEs, or multi-word expressions. So we work a lot with the data. We work a lot with collecting that data from all the different languages and tagging that data. So what we've noticed is that the current, if you take a look at new technologies that are emerging in the field, for example, OpenAI just launched earlier this year in June, and they trained all of their AI on 175 billion parameters. And when you go into the background and you look at the kind of data sets that they're using the Penn Tree Bank data set that was tagged in 1993. It was tagged by a group of linguists at the university by their housewives or their wives who were native speakers of English. But the process was supposed to be a very simplified tagging system where they could process about 1,000 words per hour. These wives were going through the data very, very quickly to tag everything. And so what happened is you have this Penn Tree Bank data set that has a lot of problems in it. It was developed almost 30 years ago, and it has become the state of the art for all machine learning up to today. So even Siri, Alexa, a lot of the technologies that you find built into your devices, OpenAI was also trained on the Penn Tree Bank data sets. But when we go in and we look at the data set and we look at how things were tagged, they're not using a deep syntax model. They're not using a semantic cross-reference model in there. So all of this has to be redone for every single language. You have to re-tag everything. And so what happens is that it becomes a massive job. It's not a scalable solution, and there are a lot of mistakes in the original data. But they took that original data and they went on to tag billions of sentences and what we call corpora. And now you have movie databases, you have all these databases and tagged databases, but they were based off of what I would say is a data set that has problems. And today they wonder why. It's sort of like you're downstream at a river, and you see all these problems coming down the stream, and you're wondering, how do we fix these problems? If you just go upstream, I think that you can fix the problems at the source. So our technique right now and our solution is to go to the source of the problem, retag everything with a deep syntax using role and reference grammar that actually maps across all languages of the world. And so we can actually tie the semantics and syntax at that level, patterning across the sentence. And so what happens is that you have everything tagged in a certain clause, having a unique tag. So you don't have subjects and objects marked in there. The structure works great for ergative languages. There is some ergativity that exists in English as well. So this creates a tagging structure that actually defines everything very well. And it defines it in a sense where if a machine were looking at events in the real world, how would the machine label semantically and syntactically that event? For example, when you say a car accident happens, we use the car accident as the subject in English. And in Russian, you say the car accident after the verb, but it's not the object, it's still the subject. It's the same in some other languages. And some languages disagree about whether it's the subject or the object. The fact is, a car accident happens is an existential. It really has no subject or object. And so we're looking at problems like this, and we're trying to define them. We're trying to define all of the real world events, things that happen in real life, and how a computer would be able to understand a stative situation versus an existential situation. We bring all of that data in the back end to the end user. We figure out what the end user, the student in language education, what they've mastered, what they haven't mastered yet, the vocabulary they haven't learned yet. We track all of their progress. We tie their positioning into that data set. So the data set allows us to actually permute and figure out everything from the simplest sentence structure to the most complex, both semantically and syntactically. So that sorting is something that teachers struggle to do. How should I teach my student? Should I teach them basic sentences with just adjectives first, or should I teach them verb conjugations first? Teachers have to make a lot of choices. Sometimes they skip around in their textbooks. And so those are the issues that we're trying to solve, is how can we help teachers prepare that material in an order, and then the teachers can actually take that and then do more interaction with the students and spend more time with actual language creation. And so the students get really structured training for the pattern recognition. And so we provide that pattern recognition delivered directly to the student, helping them find a direct path to fluency. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much for that. I want to ask one quick question before we shift to Priya, because it directly relates while it's fresh in our mind. Do you also see part of the value proposition of Glossika as a preservation tool of languages, minor languages, small languages, languages where maybe there's only a few hundred people who currently speak them? Is that currently part of your mission, or could you imagine that being part of your mission?
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time. But I have, part of my story is that I have spent time in the mountains, and I've learned Aborigine languages that are not written. And I have a lot of friends who are Aborigine speakers. Some have already passed away. The languages don't exist anymore. I can speak at least one language that doesn't exist anymore.
Wow.
So the thing is about these languages that, yes, there is a community that exists. They want to have that language. They want to have that culture. They want to have that identity. And so languages really equal identity. It's important for people to have that identity. It's one thing to speak the world's common language, as we are doing now, but it's important that we go home and we have an identity where we're not using the world language, but we're using the one that we connect with, that has a history. And so in one way, we can help those languages in that way. And I think that as a personal interest, where I've gone out into the field and done this kind of work, I feel that it's important that we are able to scale at a level where we can also solve their problems. We don't have the budget to help them, but we can build scalable solutions where they can actually come on the service and then help themselves.
That's fascinating. And there's a whole philosophical area that could be explored here about certain cultures that don't want their languages written down because they feel they should only be embodied. And maybe we can even discuss that for a second in the Q&A. But this is a wonderful anchor to begin this discussion. Michael, thank you very much. We're stay in the wings because we will have you come back on after the other two panelists have spoken. And one note about Q&A. So for listeners who are tuning in via Zoom, there is a Q&A button, or maybe it's two heads at the bottom of your Zoom interface. You can use that to ask questions. You can do it continuously. You need not wait till the end, and we will address those collectively in the Q&A, or if they're for an individual speaker, they may just respond to you in text, but please do utilize that function, or in the chat. But anyway, now we are joined now by Priya Lakhani, who's calling in from London.
Priya is the founder and CEO of Century Tech, and welcome to EUNIC DX AI Week.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So to tell you a little bit about Century and what we're doing. So I've got a couple of roles here. I'm on the UK Government AI Council. I'm the founder and chief executive of Century. You know, how this technology first came about is I think an interesting story to tell, because it was about trying to identify the problems in the education sector and then trying to figure out how to solve them with tools and technology. I think sometimes there are some tech companies that can often create a solution because the tech is it's so cool, it's so new, it's sexy technology. It's how do I retrofit this into a particular market? And with education, what we found was a really important factor was that we looked at the sector. We were able to go into schools, into colleges, higher educational institutions, publishers, speak to them about how they are essentially working within the sector and figure out what the problems were. And the problems we could see across the board. And if we think predominantly right now, just try and think of formal education and higher education, we could see that there was still very much a one-size-fits-all delivery of education. You know, teachers stand at the front, lecture to a group of students, and we could see that, you know, what we really wanted, what every teacher wants, is a personalised and differentiated education for their students, and that's certainly what every student deserves. And then we could also see that constant formative assessment is an incredibly powerful part of education. The idea that we can give those short little tests. We remember when we were at school every Friday or so, you know, a little test in a topic, or in higher education, just trying to then embed the knowledge or trying to understand how students are doing. The issue is that when a teacher has to mark 30 in an average school class size, 60, 80, 100 when it comes to higher education sometimes, that those formative assessments, that takes a lot of the educator's time. And an educator didn't sign up to sit there and mark tests and then become a data analyst to try and figure out, how is my cohort doing? Who's struggling? Who's excelling? Where do I need to make an intervention? And so those were two significant issues that existed across the board, from the UK, where I am, to the US, to parts of Africa, India, across the globe. And so we thought, well, how can we solve these problems? You know, education hasn't really transformed radically in terms of innovation, apart from going from a blackboard to an interactive whiteboard. So how can we think about using systems? And so this is where we looked at AI, we looked at big data, we looked at technologies and thought, you know, why have these technologies managed to disrupt and transform every other sector in the world, but they haven't really touched education? And there's many reasons for that. There's the funding in ed tech and the fact that investors often prefer, if they like a quick return, not to invest in ed tech, which is a shame. Although that's changing because of COVID now. There were issues such as education is quite slow to change. The change management side, you know, going through the Rogers adoption curve from the innovator and the pioneer all the way to the late majority is a lot slower in education. But also, you know, sector. So we decided that focusing on those two problems, we would build a system which now exists, and it's called Century, and it's been around for 7 years. But a system that learns how you learn. So imagine learning how Julian and Caroline's brains learn. Now, the reason why this is really important was that we couldn't build a system that was content agnostic, so it can have any curriculum, any language. The platform is already translated into different languages, including Arabic, which all goes right to left. But a system that that uses AI in the same way that Netflix or Amazon use AI, where it's essentially giving you recommendations about what you like and prefer. The reason why that doesn't work in education, it was tried in the US. There were companies out there initially that brought out that sort of machine learning technology, is because in education, you don't always give a student what they like, right? It's not about, here's a whole cohort of students that preferred a certain type of content or subject. Now let's give everyone else the same type of content or subject if they behave in the same way. Education doesn't work that way. It's much more nuanced. Sometimes you need to give someone what they don't want to learn. Sometimes you need to give them something that just plugs a gap in knowledge or that stretches them in a certain way. And so we built a machine that leverages true AI. And when I say true AI, what I mean is, and there are many, there's a whole other conference that we could have on what is AI, because engineers disagree about this all the time, but it leverages machine learning. So the idea that it's looking at patterns and correlations in behavior. It leverages deep learning, so neural networks, building networks, trying to understand information, how people interact with content, digestible digital assets of content in education. But the machine then combines neuroscience. So what do we know about how the brain learns? And it will learn Julian and Caroline's knowledge, skills, gaps in knowledge, gaps in skills, focus levels, effort levels, pace of learning. When does something go from your short-term to long-term memory? We know how important memory is in education, right? So sometimes when we're thinking about teaching someone something, even in language, right, and we test them on the Friday, it's there and they do really well. You test them 4 months later, if they haven't repeated that, it actually sits in their working memory and it disappears. And so we have to think about cognitive load theory and all of these types of theories that are actually incredibly important. But the idea is, how do you now use those to actually further and enhance education, increase the quality of education? So how can you embed information so it becomes knowledge and then apply skills upon that knowledge? We know that, again, a bigger question, but when we look at students who are now looking for jobs, the graduates of today, the graduates of 2030 and 2040, the types of skills that they might need are not necessarily the types of skills that we're educating them for. So the idea is the application of that knowledge is very, very important. We don't just want them to regurgitate, because regurgitating is what an AI can do very well. So we built a machine that learns how your brain learns, and that's been applied in educational institutions, from schools to further education to higher education to national programs run by ministries of education to publishers who produce content, whether it's language or whether it's sort of traditional formal education content. And the system's been applied to be able to then provide students with that personalized and differentiated education. Because it is an AI and it's learning how you learn, it's an autonomous machine that makes decisions by itself. So that is, for me, the sort of simplest definition of AI. Doesn't require a human to be plugging into it all the time, input and output. It's starting to make decisions by itself. It uses big data. And then the idea behind the teacher side, that problem that I talked about teachers' constant formative assessment and feedback, being able to listen to students, being able to listen to how they enunciate, how they pronounce words, being able to feed back to them, for example, all that time you want the human teacher to be able to spend doing. What you don't want the teacher to be doing is sitting there marking and assessing something that can be automated. We use the big data analysis, and then we provide to teachers real-time insights about where interventions are necessary. So if you are teaching a group of students, where do you need to intervene? Where do you, as the human, need to spend more time? And I love the way you explained it, Caroline, from a previous panel, that what you brought up is the most beautiful point, which was, AI is there to augment the human. AI is there to bring out the more beautiful part of the human, right? In education, it's very much the same. Can it replace teachers? My firm answer is no. It will never replace that one-to-one interaction between one human and another. But what it can do is augment it. If we think, I constantly say, the most important person in the classroom is a student. The most powerful person in the classroom is a teacher. And so if the teacher is so powerful, why do we waste so much of his or her time? And so here, Century is there solving those problems. And obviously very happy to talk about the ethics of AI, the data side of things, how the technology works in the Q&A. But thank you very much for having me here. And hopefully you got a little taste about the work that we're doing.
Priya, thank you so much. That was a very clear overview. And there are a lot of interesting questions that come up around privacy, around the training of teachers, around adoption, asymmetrical adoption in different regions, and what that means for how those students learn. I'll be excited to come back to those in the Q&A. Unless you have an immediate question, we'll probably move to Riina for now, and then we can come all together and speak about these synthetically. But thank you, Priya. That was super. We are now being joined by Riina Vuorikari. I hope that's right. It's the Finnish name. Is that correct?
Yes.
Who's a research fellow at the European Commission Joint Research Center in Sevilla, Spain. She's also had a great amount of experience in the area of technology enhanced learning and e-learning for schools, and has worked with an array of European educational entities, from the European Schoolnet to the Flemish Ministry of Education to the CGIAR Foundation. Very interested to hear how these technologies that we've just learned about from Priya and Michael sound to you. Maybe though you could start with familiarizing us with the focus of your research now.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I work for the European Commission. The Joint Research Center, the JRC, is sort of an in-house think tank for the Commission. Our aim is to provide policymakers, both at the EU level and at the member state level, with evidence-based sort of a research in order to support policymaking. So this is really important if we think about the field of you name it, nuclear science. If we talk about climate change, but also in education, we can use known knowledge and evidence to drive really policymaking and these decisions. And this is exactly becoming, of course, very important now with the time of COVID, and we're talking about digital learning. For decades, we have introduced already digital learning in schools, but it has never been the situation where we replace the school building, where actually this social interaction becomes all of a sudden mediated by technology. So this is really new thing. So that's what we are doing in general. And let's say now with the AI, all emerging technologies, all the things that we heard, interesting applications. Of course, policymakers are thinking, what does it mean to schools in my country? What does it mean to teachers in my country, and so on? So one of the methods that we use also is creating these foresight reports. So talking about different futures. So we have a report that I will talk about today. It's called Emerging Technologies and the Teaching Profession. And here we're talking about, let's say, robotics, social robotics. We're talking about AI-based systems to support teachers, like what we heard there. There are systems that are there to support students learning, and there are then the systems that are really actually teaching. So these are typically the tasks that teachers have. Teachers are there for instructional practices, they are there to support learners, they are there to do the assessment, and they are there for managing the classroom environment in general. So if we talk about what is the role of these in the future, we very quickly go into talking about replacing teachers. And this is not exactly like what Priya was saying. We're not wanting to replace the teacher there, but we're wanting to enhance and augment possibilities for that one-to-one learning and for that interaction that is there also among students, because we know that learning happens in a social environment. So our job with these future scenarios was kind of start thinking, what are the problems that teachers have in education? Exactly very similar what Priya said just a while ago. We looked at the study by TALIS, by OECD called TALIS, and their teachers say for example, they have hard time when the classroom size is so big. They have less time for teaching because there are so many admin tasks that they have to take into account. Teachers have a hard time motivating students who have learning difficulties. They have hard time with special education students in a classroom. They don't necessarily feel that they are ready and they have the knowledge needed. So we looked at in these scenarios, what kind of support could these new emerging technologies give to teachers? At the same time, we wanted to sort of flesh around what are the pedagogical models behind them. It was interesting to hear both speakers before because oftentimes edtech, not only this AI thing that we're talking about today, but edtech in general is pushed there by industry. And it's usually just taking something that works at the work environment, works for another context, and it's adapted for learning. We can think about content management systems. They were not initially created for education. We think about now Zoom and all these video conferencing systems. They were not originally created for education. So they don't have the pedagogical support that teachers necessarily need. You know, imagine doing all the video conferences. That really puts the teacher in the center. Again, this is like the teacher facing way of teaching. It's not necessarily conducive for very student-centered pedagogies. So that kind of things we try to flash out in our report, where we talked about different scenarios. They are very short stories. We also wanted to flash out the part of decision-making. Now in this case, we talk about automated decision-making, and we are asking, where is the situation and where should the teacher be in this setting? Is it teacher in the loop? Is it teacher over the loop, or teacher out of the loop? These are the terms used when we talk about, for example, self-driving cars. Is human in the loop? We think that there are situations where teachers should be in the loop, where the system, for example, does a diagnostic, and the decision is not automatically taken by the system or the algorithm, but actually is given for the teacher. Here is what we think is happening, but the teacher still takes that decision, him or herself. There are other situations where we can just think of a learning material being recommended to students, and there, you know, sometimes it's not so critical for teacher being in the loop. So it also depends, like how much harm would a wrong decision to do for the user, for the learner. Also in this report, we want to encourage the policymakers who are making policies about education at the national and local level to start discussing about datafication in education. There's a lot of data being nowadays collected about learners. They can be collected either the systems that are used in school, but also out of school. And there's student data, there's behavioral data, and so on. So there are a few interesting examples. For example, in the Netherlands, they have already this kind of a thinking of, they call it weighing values. So ethical perspective in digitalization of education. There are actually these sort of a guidelines or like a speaking help, like what kind of issues should we bring out and start discussing with teachers, with parents, with those who design these systems, the users. So this kind of all stakeholders coming together and discussing where do we want to go with this technology in education and what is its place? Is it really this core replacing teacher? Or what we think is now very important is that learners are, for example, self-directed learners, that they take more also agency in their own decisions about learning. If these systems just recommend you the next thing after another, where do we teach that kind of a self-directedness in learning? With COVID, social and personal learning skills, you know, for kids to learn alone at home, they become very important. So we want these systems to support that kind of a competence building, not replace or make these very important skills redundant in the future. So I think I leave you here, so I'm not spoiling everything. You will be interested in reading the report. So thank you for your attention, everybody.
Thank you, Riina. That was a great overview. Before we bring everybody else back on, I do have one other question that maybe is most directed to you. Can you give us just a brief update as to the status of technologically enabled learning in Europe right now? Like, what's the state? What kinds of programs are in use widely? What maybe is on the near horizon? And what do you think is quite far afield?
Like we talked about, like I mentioned, content management systems and these virtual learning environments. They are offered nowadays by a lot of schools. And we actually did a study about the COVID sort of a situation and what kind of tools kids were made available by schools. So there's a lot of content management systems where they can so get the content, but also communicate, do collaboration work. But there's also these conferencing tools I used a lot. We do have learning apps a lot, and that's a learning sort of edutainment area also. But this is also like something that happens out of school, you know? And this is interesting, like if we think of Europe versus China, for example, there these out of school technologies are really heavily used for training and for a purpose of entrance exams, for example, to universities. We don't currently, well, in Europe, we have so many different education systems, and coming from Finland, we don't do standardized testing, which is kind of a question mark for everybody. But so we don't have similar focus in education, in testing in all countries in Europe, whereas some other systems are more focused on that. So what we also want to make really is this collaboration among students more possible, because we know that that's really important for future and also a skill that is needed in future work.
And so many students are already so comfortable anyway in the digital environment. It's a very natural extension of the way that their autodidactic learning happens. One last question is are there currently any affordances built into whatever kind of state-directed education mandate for teachers to reskill in digital learning?
That's really important. Actually, in this report, we were also thinking what kind of skills teachers or knowledge teachers need about these systems in the future. And in European Union, we have something called DigComp Edu, so Digital Competence Framework for Educators. And there it is exactly this idea, how do we use technologies for those tasks that I was talking about, for instructional practices, for supporting learners learning, for assessment purposes, and for classroom management, but importantly also for teachers to teachers' professional learning, their own development, professional development as a teacher. So that's a DigComp Edu framework. I'll put it in the chat also later.
Okay, super. Thank you, Riina. And now maybe we could bring Michael and Priya back on so that we can all discuss together. We'll see. Pedro or Robert, if you could, yes. And also Michael. Great. Okay. So I want to start with one hard question for both Michael and Priya, which is reflect, obviously your programs are very different. Michael, Glossika is more user-directed. It's at the level of the user trying to improve their language skills directly with the use of a program. Priya, as I understand it, yours is an intelligent intervention tool, primarily for teachers or for institutions in order to better gauge what their students need or understand how they learn. Can you each self-reflectively mention one of the potential hazards of your respective tool scaling and what prophylactic measures you might imagine taking to mitigate that?
Yeah, just to be clear, so mine is actually it's a learner platform. So yeah, no problem. No, learners log in. You'd be surprised it takes a long time to explain it, because these are new technologies. You know, it's not something that we can put in a mental construct and say, okay, that exists. We've seen that before. So learner logs in, and by tracking, like Google search, mouse movement technology and behaviors, it learns how they learn, personalizes for them. So you can actually use it autonomously just as a student. And then the data is crunched and analyzed so an educator can look in and look at analysis. So one of the biggest challenges for us, and an area that is very difficult, is obviously we're a hugely ambitious organization. We really do want to change the world in education. I very much agree with what Riina was saying in terms of, well, I love the fact that you don't have standardized tests, by the way. It's something that I am lobbying for. I'm not sure how much success I'm having. But one of the challenges is that to be truly ambitious and to think about this from a social enterprise, social justice perspective, you really want the technology to be accessible to all. And so AI has the potential to really improve education so dramatically. The independent measures are an improvement of outcomes of across the board by 30% if you're economically disadvantaged or not, which is incredible. The challenge is, how do you get this technology to everybody without actually, you want to level the playing field using technology and provide access to education. But the problem is that AI potentially, because AI has to be online, right? People say, well, can you have it offline? And I'm like, well, yeah, you can have offline technology and then go up to some sort of Wi-Fi connection and it will then sort of download what it, and there's all of that. But AI, true AI, real time, constant recommendations is online. And so you have that problem where that key triangle I always talk about, which is infrastructure, hardware and software. People get so excited about buying shiny new tablets, right? Oh, look at this, we bought this for our institution. Or they get really excited about we're using AI. The problem is you need all three. You need the bandwidth, you need the hardware and the software. And some people talk about AI and actually they don't even have a data strategy to begin with. So what's really interesting about the technology and the biggest challenge for us, and it's really disheartening, is when we want to move into some parts of Africa, parts of India, some parts of the UK, the United Kingdom is not fully connected, and Uruguay is more connected in its schools because it has fibre in every school than what we have in England. And so that accessibility issue is a constant problem. And it's a problem where we need the entire ecosystem to work cohesively. We need the governments to work together, to work within the country to provide the infrastructure and the bandwidth. Digital has to be, in terms of an infrastructure perspective, an absolute priority. COVID has definitely shined the spotlight on the countries that haven't quite got that right. We need the institutions, so in higher education specifically, we need some rather old and traditional, very well respected and wise institutions to also have a digital strategy that is not just a strategy, it's something they genuinely want to execute and implement and invest in. And then we also need, obviously, software companies like ours, like Glossika. We're going to continue doing what we're doing. Why? Because we're entrepreneurs, right? We're innovators. We like to invent things. We like hard problems. We don't like easy problems. So you can always rely on the entrepreneur to go a bit crazy and sound mad and come up with some crazy. Riina will say, oh, but this is a problem from our research that we found that they're really struggling with, and there'll be some crazy entrepreneur who'll want to go solve that problem, and that's fine. But you need the entire ecosystem to work effectively. So the biggest challenge is not the software. We've got through that. We've had GDPR, we've had beyond GDPR, what's actually ethical, how do we avoid algorithm bias? There's all of that. How do we create scalable technology? That's possible, with cloud and devices. Mobile has been the biggest. But the issue is the infrastructure. And what's very disheartening, and this is across the board for any edtech entrepreneur, is when you have the technology, you have a very willing stakeholder from a particularly difficult, challenged part of the world. It might be a war-torn area, it might be an area where there's disadvantage. They're willing, and because they've got nothing to lose, they don't have to get rid of legacy technology to take yours because they've got no technology. So they're up for it. They're saying, we know to go to AI. We don't want an LMS. We don't want a bugs. We don't want all of that because we know that doesn't really work as well. We want a personalized system, and you can't provide. And there is nothing worse than that situation, because what you've then done is you provided it to the economically advantaged in the world, so they get better and better, and the disadvantaged stay where they are. So working with UNESCO, working with UNICEF, working with, you see how it becomes a very big ecosystem. That's the challenge. Yeah. And then you've got to turn around to your investors and you've got to say, but we need to do all this. It's huge. And it's the time is, it's a long time lag, right? There's a time scale because we're working with these. So that's the biggest challenge that I see, that COVID has catalyzed, because it really has, created a spotlight and it's been shining on the lack of infrastructure. But I just want to say one thing, which is, let's all learn from this. Let's not just get over this somehow. And in 18, 24 months time, God forbid it takes longer, but somehow forget. And then the next crisis, we're sat in the same position, because that would be a real shame.
Yeah, well, hopefully a conference like this, which is focused towards EU cultural institutions, will be seeding that idea. And it's interesting to hear you say, like, we actually need regulation because then we know where to build next. That's actually something you're not trying to resist. You're actually welcoming intelligent, progressive regulation so that you can continue to build.
Well, we need the infrastructure, but I say we need regulation just from a general perspective for AI anyway, because AI has just, regulation's always chasing innovation. That's always the way it will be. It's always something that you look at in retrospect and think, what do we need to manage? Regulation's a bit slow. When it comes to AI today, regulation's been fun. It's because it's global. You need people to agree. You can't do one thing in one part of the world and then expect the other part of the world. Technology has created a big problem for us. But what I would also just like to say there, though, is that this technology is a force for good. It has been invented for good purposes.
Sure.
You just can't stop the bad actors, and you can't stop the complacent.
Right. Technology is agnostic at the end of the day. It depends whose hands it's in and what the intention behind it is. I think we should now turn to Michael, who is actually being in Taipei. I also wonder if you have a slightly different perspective on how the Asian community interacts with technology. But the initial prompt was, what hazard do you imagine, could you foresee possibly with Glossika, although it seems to be made with the best intentions. And I mean, it seems like a relatively benign instrument, but at scale, things do turn different. I don't know if you want to add another vector to that. No, just keep it. Okay, so yes, what hazard do you imagine? And then what do you imagine could be done prophylactically in order to prevent against whatever worst outcome?
Well, to begin with, I have to agree with Priya on most of the points, especially infrastructure, because we do get organic growth and users from around the world, whether that's India and Africa, but also a lot from Europe as well. And I mean, even our team is actually surprised at times when we have European customers saying, could you please provide this downloaded option or this offline option or an app, because my internet just isn't so good, but it just causes you to, pause for a moment to think, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made, even in developed countries. Okay, so that being said, I think one of our biggest challenges, and I think it sounds like Priya's position is that she doesn't see it as much of a challenge, which is the data and the bias. And I think that a lot of the problems that we're seeing today, when we talk about AI not working properly, or when we talk about the biases that we start to see emerge, I think the problem goes back to, what is the data that you're collecting? You have to go upstream, right? You have to check, what is the data you're collecting? Why does it fail? Let me give you a simple example. I go to the gym every morning, and our gym now has, here in Taipei, they have I'm sorry for those of you who can't go to the gym, but our lifestyle is still normal. Okay, so they have this face recognition thing, but you see, I don't look like the normal, resident here in Taiwan. I'm a minority, so it always fails on me. And so I always need to get somebody from the desk to come open the gate to let me in, because they only have this face recognition thing. But I completely understand why, because it's trained on the local population, of which most people don't look like me. And so it doesn't work. They say we have a smart gate, but it just doesn't work for me. Okay, so And I think that really has to do with what is available, because here it's a very homogeneous society. So there's very little training that they can get, especially for a private company. So the bias is there. I mean, I don't let it affect me. I mean, we understand why that happens. The point here is that why did I mention OpenAI earlier is because when the developers are kind of naive towards the data sets that are openly available on the internet. You can go to GitHub, you can go to Kaggle, you can go to a lot of different places and download these data sets. These are publicly available data sets. And a lot of developers think, oh, somebody's already done the data. I'm just gonna go grab this data set and plug it in and run a few Python scripts, and I can get, I can plug and play and make this thing work for my boss, for this company. But the problem is that as a linguist, and I go in and I actually test very specific problems to make sure that the data is right and that it's giving me the output that I want. What I find is that there's just a lot of data that has not been tagged. There's a lot of data that is just not working properly. And so it makes me ask questions. I need to go upstream. I need to work on the data itself. We need to build a new NLP package, a new Glossika Python package. I don't know what we're going to call it, but something needs to be done with the original data sets. And it's hard to imagine that these big companies, sometimes I wonder, why does it cost $1 billion for OpenAI to develop their latest round of AI. And then that solution is only one spot in time. It's not going to take into account all of the COVID news and everything else that's been happening every day. They have to go back to their massive computer and then retrain a new version of that AI. And that's going to take months or even years, maybe another $1 billion. Why do they need 175 billion parameters to get to this level of AI? I think that if we go back and we fix the data sets and we really go into a scalable solution on the tagging and we really define things really well from the very beginning, you don't need 175 billion parameters. Maybe you just need 1 million. Maybe you just need a few million. And then you can run your training on a daily basis rather than every 6 months or every year. And I think that this is a massive, just like Priya mentioned, I must be absolutely mad to be trying to chase after this problem because it's massively huge. I'm trying to do it across languages. And like Priya said, there's languages that go left and right and, and up and down. And it's just, there's a lot of, code set problems with different characters. And it really is a maddening assignment, but I believe that I'm really well positioned to take this on because I'm very passionate about languages in general and how they work and everything that goes into a language and how people communicate. I think that after I've learned so many languages to this date, I find that people are pretty much the same around the world and they have the same thoughts and feelings and desires and we're all human. And I think that if we can get more people to understand more languages, you don't have to speak them, but if you can understand that person who looks and seems to act differently than yourself, but if you understand what you're saying, you'll find that they're just like you. They're
build empathy.
Build empathy, and I believe that I've been saying this for years. I believe that we're developing HI, which is human intelligence.
That's great.
So I believe that AI helps us build machines like Glossika is, which basically is using a pattern recognition system that AI uses to learn the patterns of languages, but we're doing it to train humans. And the thing about human brains is that we pick up the patterns so much faster. We don't need 6 months or a year to train on, of course the computer can go much faster in terms of the amount of data, but we don't need 100 billion, we don't need 100 billion data sets to learn something. We only need maybe 1,000 here, 1,000 there, and we get it. And so I think humans is a much better investment. We can use AI to help enhance HI, human intelligence. So that's my mission. That's my mission. Thank you very much.
Both of you, both Priya and Michael, you both are doing that, free up some bandwidth for humans to then focus on what humans do best. So these are both very interesting projects. I do want to ask more questions, but I am concerned about time. What do you think? Do you have a speed round, or is yours opening up another?
Mine might be opening up a big.
Should you leave us with a thought for the?
Well,
for the future?
I wonder what machine learning or AI might be teaching us about the way we learn, or might be whether it's if it's teaching us any new things either about the way we learn, or perhaps within the world of linguistics itself. Is it teaching us anything new about a universal grammar theory? What is it revealing to us about ourselves that we may not have realized in the past?
Maybe like a very short, if each person could answer just like very short, like just like a 20 second. Yeah.
Okay. I think that we've learned so much in the last 20 years with computing that I cannot imagine why we're using data sets that were done in 1993. I just cannot understand why. There's so much advance done in this field, and we really need to retag everything. So that's my point of view.
We're learning an enormous amount on neuroscience. We're learning about how students with autism on the autistic spectrum, how they learn, dyslexic students, if a student has no special needs, how they learn. We're learning about each and every piece of content. So how does content then be digested? How does physics relate to maths, relate to English? How does literacy levels relate to how somebody's doing on a particular topic in biology? Our machine is tracking all of that and analysing all of that. So actually the insights on how we learn, how the content is then put forwards to the student, how teacher engagement with the interventions then affects the impact, or if a teacher doesn't engage, can it be done autonomously by a student? What sort of engagement, what sort of behaviour then improves outcomes? all of that is essentially at our fingertips, and we do leverage that when we're working with our ministries of education or our publishers or our schools. You know, we are saying we know this, so therefore that then shapes future strategy, which is always a nice thing to be able to do and fascinating. But obviously I wish we could do it in every country if everybody has the bandwidth and infrastructure available.
Yeah. And Riina.
Yeah, I would like to say, like, we talk about how we teach machines to learn and understanding how learners learn and so on. What is really important is also that the learners learn how they learn, you know, making the learning explicit for learners. How do I learn best these languages? So I'm thinking, can this AI help me to know how I learn best and support me in those? And that's, I think, is very important. And because the focus is on the learner. Our goal here is to eventually, you know, make learners learn better and more aware of their own learning. We talk about the skill called learning to learn. And also at the European level, we're putting forward a framework called a personal, social, and emotional learning to learn framework. So those are the new skill sets that are really needed. And how can these technologies help us to become more aware of our, you know, what's happening around all the school bullying, for example? How do we, you know, make people to intervene at the right moment, be empathetic, you know, help that kind of a critical situations there. So that's for me the goal in the future.
I'm so glad to hear that, because I mean, I think all of us are aware of this increasing radicalization of the online space, polarization of the online space, these charismatic YouTubers who like on-ramp people to radicalization. And I'm so glad to hear that the emotional, the empathetic, that some of these qualities are being considered in the realm of online learning, because, and we should be able to sense those. And that, of course, now that we're all atomized in screens, it may be more difficult to detect when a student is starting to go down one of these other paths.
Exactly.
So that's very cool.
I would just like to say that in a classroom situation, teachers implicitly, you know, they look around, they look at the learners, they see where somebody's struggling, if something's going wrong. With this online space, it's harder for them to do that. So that's why we have to be talking about those things more explicitly now, especially of it, because that's really becoming important factor. If we have more pandemics, more school closures, that's where we should be, you know, looking at, and I hope technology will be helping us there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, Michael Campbell, Priya Lakhani, Riina Vuorikari. This has been an incredibly edifying session. You can find out more in, there's one more
Riina,
question for Riina that just popped up from an anonymous attendee. Maybe you can stay on. I will just say, you can check the chat. You can find links to Glossika and to Century Tech, and also to Riina's report in the chat. There's one question from...
The question is, Riina, if there is a shift in Europe towards new schooling approaches, in the sense that maybe now it's better for us to guide children on how to reach correct information rather than just classic teaching methods. You know, essentially, you know, if the focus should approach instead of teaching children how to learn, so that they do reach correct information. And I imagine a world of increasing disinformation.
Yeah, I think there is a awareness of that in Europe now, and I think we are putting it forward as a European Commission. Of course, we can't say what member states have to do in education, because that's their own competence, but we are putting forward these ideas which are in line with European values. And that's what we want Europeans to be in the future, that they are self-directed learners, they are more empathetic, they take you know, actions also, when they see something bad happening, they try to correct it. So those we also try to put into education, and give teachers ideas, how can you do this? Give policymakers ideas. In some countries, this kind of teaching methods have worked well, or these pedagogical practices have worked well to support this. That's the role where a commission can bring experts and can bring, you know, like experts and good practices up front, so that we can learn from each other.
Sounds good. Thank you, Riina.
Thank
That
you.
was very helpful. So please seek out
Good.
more of Riina's research. You can find the report in the chat. And so I know personally, I am interested in trying out Glossika for German learning so that we can finally deliver ourselves from the cursed American expat status, where the moment you utter einen deutschen Satz mit a telling amerikanischem Akzent, the conversation switches seemingly irreversible to English.
Ich weiß.